The dust swept across the plains as Quentin Wade stared out at the endless horizon, his weathered hands gripping the fence post like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to this world. At 32, he had more scars than most men twice his age, each one telling a story of the harsh Montana territory of 1878. The Double Circle Ranch had become both his salvation and his prison since he'd arrived 5 years ago, running from ghosts that still haunted his dreams. Mr. Wade. The voice cut through his thoughts. Mr. Wade, Pa says the new school teacher's wagon broke down about 3 miles east. Quentin turned to see young Tommy Peterson, no more than 12, breathless from his ride. And he wants me to fetch her, I reckon, Quentin asked, already knowing the answer. Old man Peterson never did like dealing with strangers, especially not educated women from back east. Yes, sir. Pa says she's got books and things that'll get ruined if it rains. Quentin glanced at the gathering clouds. All right then, tell your pa I'm heading out. He saddled his buckskin mare, Penny, and rode east along the well-worn trail that connected the scattered homesteads to the growing settlement of Riverspend. The town had been little more than a trading post when Quentin first arrived, but now it boasted a general store, 2 saloons, a small church, and apparently a new schoolhouse with a teacher to match. The broken-down wagon came into view just as the first raindrops began to fall. A woman stood beside it, attempting to secure a tarp over her belongings as the wind whipped her skirts around her ankles. "Madam," Quentin called out, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Peterson sent me to help." She turned, and Quentin felt something shift inside him. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional way that the saloon girls were, with their painted faces and practiced smiles. No, this woman had the kind of face that made you want to look twice intelligent eyes, a determined set to her jaw, and a few freckles scattered across her nose that spoke of someone unafraid of the sun. "Thank goodness," she said, pushing a strand of chestnut hair from her face. "The wheel just gave way entirely. I'm Josephine Caldwell, the new school teacher." "Quentin Wade," he replied, tipping his hat. "Most folks call me Quinn." "Well, Mr. Wade, I appreciate your assistance," she said formally, though there was a warmth to her voice that belied her prim exterior. As the rain began to fall in earnest, Quentin worked quickly to secure her belongings. "We won't fix this wheel today. Best I get you to town before this storm worsens. But my books will cover them proper, and I'll come back for the wagon tomorrow," he assured her. After ensuring the wagon's contents were protected as best as possible, Quentin helped Josephine onto Penny. He climbed up behind her, acutely aware of her stiffness as she sat ramrod straight, trying to maintain as much distance as propriety would allow on the back of one horse. "You'll need to hold on, Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice low near her ear. "Penny's steady, but the trail gets rough." Reluctantly, she gripped the saddle horn, still keeping her posture rigid. As they set off, the skies opened up completely. The rain came down in sheets, and despite her determination to remain proper, Josephine eventually leaned back against Quentin's chest, seeking shelter. By the time they reached Riverspend, they were both soaked to the skin. Quentin took her directly to Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, where the widow had prepared a room for the new schoolteacher's arrival. "Land's sakes, child," Mrs. Hollister exclaimed as they dripped onto her porch. "You look like you swam here instead of rode." "Wagon broke down," Quentin explained simply. "Her things are secure, but the wheel needs fixing." "Well, come in, come in. I've got hot coffee and stew." Mrs. Hollister ushered Josephine inside before turning back to Quentin. "You too, Mr. Wade. Can't have you catching your death. I should get back. Nonsense. The storm's only getting worse. You can borrow some of my late husband's clothes while yours dry by the fire." Too tired to argue, Quentin followed them inside, keeping a respectful distance from Josephine, who was being led upstairs to change. When she returned downstairs, her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore a borrowed dress that was slightly too large. Something about seeing her this way, stripped of her formal traveling clothes, made her seem more real, more approachable. "Mr. Wade," she acknowledged him with a nod as she took a seat at Mrs. Hollister's table. "Miss Caldwell." He suddenly felt aware of how rough he must look in comparison, even in the clean but ill-fitting clothes of the late Mr. Hollister, as they ate Mrs. Hollister's hearty stew, the widow kept up a steady stream of conversation, filling Josephine in on all the town gossip and asking about her journey from Boston. "And what brings you all the way out here, dear?" "Most educated ladies I know would rather die than leave civilization for our little corner of nowhere." Josephine smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "I wanted to make a difference. There are plenty of teachers in Boston, but out here, children truly need education to build better lives." "Noble," Quentin murmured, surprising himself by speaking. Josephine really looked at him for the first time. "And you, Mr. Wade, what's your story?" Quentin shifted uncomfortably. "Not much to tell. I work for Peterson, breaking horses mostly." "Mr. Wade is being modest," Mrs. Hollister interjected. "He's the finest horseman in 3 counties. Even that rich rancher Blackburn tried to hire him away, but Quinn's loyal to a fault." Josephine tilted her head, studying him. "That's an admirable quality." The way she said it, like she actually meant it, made Quentin look away. He wasn't used to genuine compliments, especially not from a woman like her. "Storm's letting up," he said, rising from his chair. "I should head back." "I'll fetch your wagon tomorrow, Miss Caldwell." "Thank you, Mr. Wade. I'm in your debt." He nodded awkwardly, changing back into his now dry clothes before heading out into the damp evening. As he rode back to the Peterson ranch, Quentin couldn't shake the image of Josephine Caldwell's intelligent eyes from his mind. The next morning, Quentin rode back to the stranded wagon with tools and a spare wheel. He worked steadily, repairing the damage while trying not to pay too much attention to the contents of the wagon, books mostly, but also small personal items that gave him glimpses into Josephine's life. A silver-framed photograph of an older couple he assumed were her parents. A small wooden box with intricate carvings. A well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice with pressed flowers marking several pages. By midday, he had the wagon ready. He hitched Penny to it and slowly drove back toward town, careful not to jostle the contents. When he arrived at the schoolhouse, he found Josephine already there, organizing the single room with its rows of simple desks. She looked up when he entered, a smile breaking across her face. "Mr. Wade, you fixed it already." "Wasn't too bad," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Just needed a new wheel and some reinforcement." "You've saved me a considerable amount of trouble," she said, approaching him. "Please let me pay you for your time." Quentin shook his head. "No need, happy to help." "At least let me offer you some lunch," she insisted. Mrs. Hollister packed enough for an army. Before he could refuse, his stomach betrayed him with an audible growl, and Josephine laughed, a clear, melodious sound that seemed to brighten the dusty schoolroom. "I reckon that's a yes," she said, her formal tone slipping for a moment into something warmer. They sat on the schoolhouse steps, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. Quentin couldn't remember the last time he'd sat in comfortable silence with anyone, let alone a woman. "So, Mr. Wade," Josephine finally said, "how long have you been in Riversbend?" 5 years or so. And before that," Quentin hesitated. "Texas mostly, drove cattle up the trails for a while. That must have been dangerous work." He shrugged. "It was living." "And now you break horses for Mr. Peterson, among other things. Ranch work doesn't really end." Josephine nodded, looking out at the small town. "I imagine it's similar to teaching in that way. There's always something more to be done. You taught before, back east." "Yes, though it was quite different from what I expect here. I had 50 students in a proper building with glass windows and a bell tower." She smiled wryly. "Here I'll have perhaps 15 children of various ages in one room if I'm lucky." "You don't seem disappointed by that," Quentin observed. "I'm not. Each child deserves education, whether they're one of 50 or one of 15. She brushed crumbs from her skirt. "Besides, there's something appealing about building something from the ground up, don't you think?" Before Quentin could answer, they were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Elkins, the town's unofficial mayor and owner of the general store. "Miss Caldwell, I see you've met our Mr. Wade," Elkins said jovially. "I hope he's been behaving himself." "Perfectly gentlemanly," Josephine assured him, rising to her feet. "In fact, he rescued me yesterday and fixed my wagon today." Elkins raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Well, wonders never cease." He turned to Quentin. "Peterson's looking for you, by the way. Got some new stock and that needs attention." Quentin nodded, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. Men like Elkin's respectable businessmen never quite approved of men like him with his rough past and rougher hands. "I should get going," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "Good luck with the school, Miss Caldwell." "Thank you again, Mr. Wade," she called after him, and something in her voice made him look back. She was still watching him, that intelligent curiosity in her eyes again, as if he were a puzzle she was trying to solve. Quentin tried to put Josephine Caldwell out of his mind as the days passed, throwing himself into work with even more dedication than usual. The Peterson Ranch was preparing for the fall roundup, and there was plenty to keep him busy: horses to train, fences to mend, cattle to move to fresh pastures. But Riversbend was a small town and their paths crossed frequently. He'd see her at the general store purchasing supplies for her students, at church on Sundays where her clear voice stood out in the hymns. Once, he even spotted her at the edge of the Peterson property, leading a group of children on what appeared to be some sort of nature lesson. Nearly 2 weeks after their first meeting, Quentin was in town picking up supplies when he heard a commotion outside the saloon. A man's angry voice rose above the general noise of the street. "You got no right to be teaching that boy ideas above his station." Quentin rounded the corner to see a red-faced rancher, Tom Briggs, looming over Josephine, who stood her ground despite being a head shorter than the man threatening her. "Every child has a right to education, Mr. Briggs," she said firmly, "and your son has a remarkable mind for mathematics." "He needs to learn ranching, not books," Briggs spat. "Now you stick to teaching girls their letters and such and leave my boy be." Quentin moved without thinking, positioning himself between Josephine and the angry rancher. "That's enough, Briggs. Stay out of this, Wade, ain't your concern. You're making a scene in the middle of town, threatening a lady. I'd say that makes it my concern." Quentin kept his voice even, but there was steel behind his words. Briggs glared, but some of the fight seemed to go out of him. "You know what I mean, Wade. Boys around here need practical skills, not fancy book learning." "Seems to me they need both," Quentin replied, "and it seems to me that's for Miss Caldwell to decide in her schoolroom." A small crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation with interest. Briggs looked around, realizing he was losing face the longer this continued. "Keep your nose out of my family business," he muttered before stalking away. Quentin turned to Josephine, who looked more angry than frightened. "You all right?" "Perfectly fine, thank you," she said, though her hands trembled slightly. "Though I'm afraid Mr. Briggs may not allow his son back in my classroom, which would be a terrible shame. The boy has real talent." "Briggs will cool down," Quentin assured her. "His bark's worse than his bite." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You seem very certain about that." "Men like him are all bluster," Quentin said with a slight shrug. "I've met plenty." The crowd began to disperse now that the excitement was over, but Josephine made no move to leave. "Would you walk with me, Mr. Wade?" "I was just heading back to the schoolhouse." Surprised, Quentin nodded, falling into step beside her. They walked in silence for a moment before she spoke again. "You have a way of appearing just when I need assistance, Mr. Wade," she observed. "It's becoming something of a pattern." "Just coincidence, madam, is it?" She glanced at him sideways. "3 times now, the broken wagon, delivering my belongings, and now this." Quentin felt heat rise in his face. He couldn't very well admit he'd been finding reasons to come into town more often, hoping to catch glimpses of her. "It's a small town," he managed. "Indeed it is," she agreed. "Which makes it all the more interesting that I know so little about you, despite everyone else sharing their life stories within minutes of meeting me." They reached the schoolhouse and she paused on the steps, turning to face him. The afternoon sun caught in her hair, bringing out auburn highlights he hadn't noticed before. "Perhaps," she said, her voice softer now, "you might consider joining me for supper one evening, Mrs. Hollister always cooks enough for an army, and I find myself with few opportunities for adult conversation these days." Quentin stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "You're inviting me to supper?" "Yes, Mr. Wade, that is generally what one does when seeking company over a meal." Her eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. "Unless that's too forward of me." "No, madam," he said quickly, "just unexpected." "Is that a yes, then?" "Yes," he replied, surprising himself with how much he wanted this. "Though folks might talk. People always talk, Mr. Wade. In my experience, it's best to give them something worth talking about." With that, she turned and entered the schoolhouse, leaving Quentin standing there with his hat in his hands, wondering what had just happened. 2 evenings later, Quentin found himself standing on Mrs. Hollister's porch, freshly shaved and wearing his Sunday clothes, a bundle of wildflowers clutched awkwardly in one hand. He'd almost talked himself out of coming a dozen times, but something kept pushing him forward, the memory of Josephine's eyes, perhaps, or the way she'd stood up to Briggs without flinching. Mrs. Hollister answered his knock, her eyebrows rising at the sight of him. "Well, don't you clean up nice, Mr. Wade? Come in, come in. Josie's just helping me finish setting the table." He followed her inside, feeling out of place among the lace doilies and china figurines that decorated the widow's parlor. Josephine emerged from the dining room, and the smile that spread across her face when she saw him made his discomfort momentarily fade. "Mr. Wade," she greeted him. "I'm so glad you came, Miss Caldwell," he replied, awkwardly thrusting the wildflowers toward her. "These are for you and Mrs. Hollister," he added hastily, not wanting to appear improper. "How thoughtful," Josephine said, accepting them with genuine delight. "I'll put them in water right away." Dinner was a surprisingly comfortable affair. Mrs. Hollister carried much of the conversation, regaling them with stories of Riverspen's early days and asking Quentin about the upcoming cattle drive. Josephine spoke of her students, her eyes lighting up as she described their progress. "Even Mr. Briggs's son returned to class," she told Quentin. "Though his father made quite a show of warning me not to fill his head with nonsense." "That's good," Quentin said, genuinely pleased for her. The boy would have suffered for his father's stubbornness otherwise. After the meal, Mrs. Hollister made herself scarce, citing mending that won't do itself, though the wink she gave Josephine suggested other motives. They moved to the small front porch, where the evening air provided relief from the lingering summer heat. "Thank you for coming tonight," Josephine said, settling into one of the porch chairs. "I've found that teaching, while fulfilling, can be rather isolating." "Can't imagine you'd be short of company," Quentin replied, leaning against the porch railing. "Seems half the unmarried men in town find reasons to visit the schoolhouse these days." She laughed softly. "Are you keeping tabs on my visitors, Mr. Wade?" "No, madam," he said quickly, though the flush creeping up his neck suggested otherwise. "Just an observation." "Well, your observation is accurate, though their interest tends to wane when they discover I expect actual conversation about topics beyond the weather and livestock prices." She looked at him directly. "You, however, manage both without seeming pained by the effort." Quentin wasn't sure how to respond to that. "Don't have much practice with fancy talk," he finally said. "I don't want fancy talk," she replied. "Just honest conversation like now." The way she looked at him, as if she could see right through to parts of himself he kept carefully hidden, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Wade?" she continued when he remained silent. He nodded, bracing himself. "Why did you really come to Riverspen 5 years ago?" Of all the questions she might have asked, this was among the most difficult. Quentin looked out at the darkening street, gathering his thoughts. "I was running," he finally admitted. "Made some mistakes in Texas. Nothing that would shock you, wanted posters with my name on them, but I hurt some people who didn't deserve it. How, was riding with a rough crew, did things I'm not proud of, nothing outright illegal, but," he shook his head. "Let's just say I wasn't the man I wanted to be." Josephine was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "And now, are you the man you want to be now?" The question struck him hard. "Working on it," he said honestly. "Some days better than others," she nodded, seeming to accept this. "That's all any of us can do, I suppose." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but something had changed between them. A barrier had been crossed, a truth acknowledged. When Quentin finally took his leave an hour later, Josephine walked him to the gate. "I'd like to do this again," she said softly. "Perhaps you could show me some of the countryside this weekend. I've been meaning to explore beyond the town limits." Quentin hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that," he replied, and was rewarded with a smile that stayed with him all the way back to the ranch. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. Quentin would find reasons to be in town, deliveries that suddenly couldn't wait, supplies that only he could select, and inevitably, his path would cross with Josephine's. Sometimes they'd share just a few words in passing. Other times, They'd spend an hour walking along the river that gave the town its name. On Sundays after church, he began to join her and Mrs. Hollister for dinner, an arrangement that raised eyebrows but was generally accepted due to the widow's presence as chaperone. During these meals, Quentin found himself opening up more than he had in years, sharing stories of his childhood in Virginia, his time on the cattle trails, even some of the darker periods he usually kept buried. In return, Josephine told him of growing up in Boston, the daughter of a professor and a seamstress who had sacrificed to give her an education. She spoke of her decision to come west, driven by both idealism and a desire to escape the confining expectations placed on women in civilized society. "My mother cried for days when I told her," Josephine admitted during one of their walks. "She was certain I'd be scalped by Indians or carried off by some rough frontiersman." Quentin smiled wryly. "Instead, you're voluntarily spending time with one." "You're hardly rough, Mr. Wade," she replied with a teasing glint in her eye. "At least not anymore, though I admit I sometimes wonder what you were like before Riverspend." "Nothing you'd want to know," he assured her. "I wouldn't be so certain," she said, her voice softer. "I find I want to know everything about you." The simple honesty of her statement caught him off guard. They had stopped walking, standing beneath the spread of an old cottonwood tree, the dappled sunlight playing across her face. Before he could think better of it, Quentin reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Josephine," he said, using her given name for the first time, "you should be careful what you wish for." Instead of pulling away, she leaned slightly into his touch. "I've never been particularly good at being careful, Quentin." The sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Quentin stepped back, his hand falling to his side as a wagon rounded the bend in the road. It was the Millers, a farming family with 3 children in Josephine's school. Mrs. Miller waved cheerfully as they passed, but Quentin didn't miss the speculative look she cast between him and Josephine. By tomorrow, he knew word of their seemingly intimate moment would be all over town. "Perhaps we should head back," Josephine suggested, though she didn't seem particularly concerned about being seen. "Probably wise," Quentin agreed, falling into step beside her. After a moment of silence, he asked, "Does it bother you, what people might say about us, you mean?" When he nodded, she considered the question seriously. "I've never put much stock in gossip. People will always talk, especially in small towns. What matters is what's true, not what's said." "And what is true, Josephine?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him, her expression open and direct. "That I enjoy your company more than anyone else's in Riverspend. That when I'm not with you, I find myself thinking about when I'll see you again." She took a deep breath. "That I care for you, Quentin, in a way I didn't expect to care for anyone here." The honesty of her declaration left him momentarily speechless. In his experience, women didn't speak so plainly about their feelings, especially not educated women like Josephine. Before he could formulate a response, she continued. "You don't need to say anything now," she assured him. "I just wanted you to know where I stand." Quentin stopped walking, gently catching her arm to turn her toward him. "Josephine, I care for you too, more than I have any right to, but you should know what you're getting into. I'm not the kind of man someone like you usually ends up with." "Someone like me," she repeated, a hint of challenge in her voice. "And what kind of woman am I exactly? Educated, refined, from a good family. And you're none of those things, is that it?" When he didn't answer, she sighed. "Quentin, do you really think I care about any of that?" "I left Boston precisely because I was tired of people who valued such superficial qualities above character." "It's not that simple, isn't it?" she interrupted. "I know who you are now, Quentin Wade. I see how you help others without seeking recognition. How you treat every person with respect, regardless of their station. How you work harder than any man I've ever known." Her voice softened. "Those are the qualities that matter to me." Quentin stood there, humbled by her faith in him, terrified of disappointing her. "I want to be worthy of that," he finally said. "Of you." "You already are," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "You don't have to prove anything to me." This time when he leaned down, there were no interruptions. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Josephine's arms slid around his neck. When they finally broke apart, Quentin rested his forehead against hers, marveling at the turn his life had taken. "We should definitely head back now," he murmured, making her laugh. "Yes, I believe we've given the gossips enough fodder for one day," she agreed. though she made no move to step away from him. As they walked back to town, hands occasionally brushing, Quentin felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since arriving in Riverspend, he was looking forward instead of back. The autumn cattle roundup kept Quentin away from town for nearly 2 weeks. The Peterson Ranch, like others in the area, was gathering its herds, branding new calves and selecting stock to sell before winter set in. It was grueling work days spent in the saddle from dawn to dusk, nights sleeping on the hard ground, every muscle aching. But for the first time, Quentin had something waiting for him beyond the work. He'd left Josephine with a promise to return as soon as the roundup finished, and the thought of seeing her again drove him to work even harder, pushing through exhaustion. On the 12th day, as they drove the last of the cattle into the home pastures, Peterson pulled his horse alongside Quentin's. "You've been working like a man possessed," the older rancher observed. "Don't think I haven't noticed," Quentin shrugged. "Just doing my job. MMM." Peterson was not a man of many words, but he saw more than people gave him credit for. "Heard you've been spending time with the schoolteacher." "Yes, sir." Quentin saw no point in denying it. "She's a fine woman." Peterson adjusted his hat, too fine for most of the men around here. "I know that," Quentin replied quietly. "Do you?" Peterson gave him a long look. "Because if you're serious about her, you should be thinking about your future. Teaching doesn't pay much, and a woman like that deserves security." The words struck Quentin harder than intended. He'd been so caught up in the wonder of Josephine's affection that he hadn't thought practically about what a future together might entail. "I've been saving," he said defensively. "Got a bit put away. Enough to start your own place, support a family." When Quentin didn't answer, Peterson sighed. "Look, son, I'm not trying to discourage you, just want you thinking ahead. That parcel on the North Ridge, the one with the spring, I'd be willing to sell it to you if you're interested. Good place for a man to start building something of his own." Quentin stared at his employer, taken aback by the unexpected offer. The North Ridge was prime land, good water, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds with enough grazing for a modest herd. "Why would you do that?" he asked bluntly. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Been watching you work for 5 years now. Never seen a man with more natural ability with horses or more dedication to doing things right. Figure you deserve a chance to build something for yourself." He cleared his throat. "Besides, my Mary always had a soft spot for you. She'd have wanted me to help." Mary Peterson had died 2 winters ago from pneumonia, but in the years before, she'd treated Quentin with a motherly kindness he'd almost forgotten existed. "I appreciate the offer," Quentin said sincerely. "Let me think on it." Peterson nodded, and they rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. But Quentin's mind was racing with possibilities that suddenly seemed within reach: his own land, his own home, a place he could bring Josephine if she'd have him. The next morning, Quentin rode into town as soon as his chores were complete. He went straight to the schoolhouse, arriving just as classes were ending for the day. Children streamed out the door, laughing and shouting, a few of them calling greetings to him as they passed. Josephine stood in the doorway, watching them go with a satisfied expression that transformed into delight when she spotted him. "Quentin," she hurried down the steps, stopping just short of embracing him in full view of her departing students. "You're back." "Just got in last night," he said, drinking in the sight of her. 2 weeks had only made her more beautiful in his eyes. "Thought I'd surprise you. Consider me thoroughly surprised," she replied with a smile, "and very pleased." He helped her close up the schoolhouse, listening as she told him about the progress her students had made in his absence. When they stepped outside, he surprised her by leading her not toward the center of town, but in the opposite direction, toward the hills that overlooked Riverspend. "Where are we going?" she asked curiously. "There's something I want to show you," he replied, offering his hand to help her up a steep part of the path. They climbed for about 20 minutes before reaching a rocky outcrop that provided a spectacular view of the valley below. Riverspend lay nestled along the river, smoke rising from chimneys, the church steeple standing tallest among the buildings. Beyond it, pastures and farmland spread out in a patchwork of gold and brown, with the darker green of pine forests covering the distant mountains. "It's beautiful," Josephine breathed, taking in the panorama. "This is Peterson land," Quentin said, pointing to the ridge below them where a natural spring created a small, verdant meadow. But this part he's offered to sell to me. Josephine turned to him, surprised. To you. For your own ranch, Quentin nodded, suddenly nervous. It's good land, the spring never runs dry, even in drought years. There's enough pasture for a decent herd, and that flat area there would be perfect for a house. He paused, gathering his courage. A family home. The implication hung in the air between them. Josephine studied his face, her expression thoughtful. Are you asking me something, Quentin? Not yet, he admitted. I wanted to show you this first, to see if you could picture yourself here before I start making plans that depend on your answer. She moved closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. And if I said yes, if I told you I could very much picture myself in a house on that meadow, what then? Then I'd start working harder than I ever have, he said softly. I'd buy this land, build that house, and when it was ready, I'd ask you properly to be my wife. Josephine smiled, a slow, radiant smile that made his heart race. That sounds like a very solid plan, Mr. Wade, she said, reaching up to touch his face. Though I hope you know I'd say yes even without the house. Quentin pulled her close, overcome with emotion. I want to give you more than promises, Josephine. I want to give you security, a future. The only future I want is one with you in it, she replied simply. They stood there on the hillside, wrapped in each other's arms, making plans and sharing dreams until the setting sun painted the valley gold. The following months were the busiest of Quentin's life. By day, he continued his work for Peterson, taking on extra tasks for additional pay. Evenings and weekends, he was clearing land on his newly purchased property, cutting timber for the house he planned to build come spring. Josephine threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy, but also found time to help with his plans, sketching designs for the house and making lists of what they'd need to start their life together. They agreed to wait until the house was built before marrying, a practical decision that nonetheless tested their patience. Their courtship became the talk of Riverspend, but for once, Quentin didn't mind the attention. The respect with which other men now treated him, acknowledging him as a future landowner rather than just a hired hand, was a new experience. Winter arrived early that year, with heavy snows in November that halted work on the house site. Quentin was forced to focus on helping Peterson's ranch weather the harsh conditions, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling feed to snowbound cattle, and rescuing calves born too early in the cold. The work was backbreaking and seemingly endless. Each morning, Quentin rose before dawn, muscles still aching from the previous day's labor. Each night he collapsed into bed, often too exhausted even to dream. But the thought of Josephine, of their future together, kept him going through the longest, coldest days. December brought the worst blizzard in living memory. 3 days of howling winds and driving snow left 6-foot drifts against buildings and buried fences completely. When it finally passed, Quentin and the other ranch hands spent a grueling week digging out and searching for stranded livestock. It was during this rescue effort that disaster struck. Quentin and 2 other men were attempting to free a group of cattle trapped in a narrow canyon when a delayed avalanche came crashing down the slope above them. The other men managed to get clear, but Quentin's horse slipped on the icy ground, throwing him directly into the path of the falling snow and rocks. He was half buried when they dug him out, unconscious and bleeding from a gash on his temple. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and his breathing was shallow and labored. The journey back to the ranch was agonizing. Every jolt of the makeshift travois they'd constructed sent waves of pain through Quentin's broken body. By the time they reached the main house, he was drifting in and out of consciousness, aware only of the pain and the urgent voices around him. The doctor was summoned from town, bringing Josephine with him after she'd insisted on coming. Quentin was only vaguely aware of her presence, at first a cool hand on his forehead, a soft voice urging him to hold on. The diagnosis was grim. A broken leg, 3 cracked ribs, and a severe concussion. The doctor set the leg as best he could and wrapped Quentin's ribs tightly, but warned that pneumonia was a serious risk given his weakened condition. He needs constant care, the doctor told Josephine and Mrs. Peterson. Keeping the fever down is critical. I'll stay with him, Josephine said immediately. When Mrs. Peterson began to object to the propriety of such an arrangement, Josephine cut her off firmly. I don't care about gossip or appearances right now. Quentin needs me and I'm not leaving his side. For 3 days and nights, Josephine barely slept, sponging Quentin's fevered body with cool water, forcing broth between his cracked lips, and whispering encouragement when he grew restless. She read to him for hours poetry, novels, even her teaching notes, anything to let him hear her voice. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Quentin opened his eyes to find Josephine dozing in a chair pulled close to his bed, her hand still holding his. The movement of his fingers tightening around hers woke her, and the relief that flooded her face told him how close he'd come to not waking at all. "Welcome back," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "How long?" His voice was a rasp, his throat raw. 4 days, she replied, helping him take a sip of water. "You gave us quite a scare." As his mind cleared, Quentin became aware of the extent of his injuries. The slightest movement sent pain shooting through his chest, and his splinted leg throbbed mercilessly. "The doctor says you'll recover," Josephine continued, reading the question in his eyes. "But it will take time. The leg was a bad break. He's not certain how well it will heal." The implications hit Quentin hard. Ranch work required strength and agility. A man who couldn't ride, couldn't rope, couldn't handle fractious horses was of little use. "The property," he said, trying to sit up despite the pain. "The house, lie still," Josephine pressed him gently back. "None of that matters right now. All that matters is you getting better." But in the days that followed, as Quentin regained his strength, the reality of his situation became increasingly clear. The broken leg would heal eventually, but the doctor warned it might never be as strong as before. The ribs would mend, but the deep bruising to his chest had weakened his lungs, making him susceptible to respiratory ailments. Worse than the physical pain was the growing fear that he would no longer be able to provide the future he'd promised Josephine. The land he'd purchased suddenly seemed like a mocking reminder of dreams that might never come to fruition. As soon as he was able to move about with crutches, Quentin insisted on returning to the bunkhouse at Peterson's ranch, despite Josephine's objections. Pride wouldn't let him continue accepting the family's hospitality when his usefulness to them was in question. The winter dragged on, and Quentin pushed himself mercilessly, determined to regain his strength. He started with small tasks, mending tack, sharpening tools, gradually working up to more demanding chores despite the constant pain. Each night he collapsed onto his bunk, exhausted beyond measure, only to rise the next morning and push himself even harder. Josephine visited whenever weather permitted, bringing books and home-cooked meals, her concern growing as she watched him drive himself beyond reasonable limits. "You're not giving yourself time to heal properly," she argued during one visit, finding him pale and sweating after attempting to break a particularly stubborn colt. "Quentin, this isn't helping anyone, least of all yourself." "What would you have me do?" he demanded, frustration boiling over. "Sit idle while everything I've worked for slips away. The payments on the land are due, and Peterson can't keep paying a man who's half useless indefinitely. He's already said he'll extend your employment, out of pity," Quentin cut her off bitterly. "Not because I'm earning my keep." Josephine's expression hardened. "Is that what you think of me too, that I'm here out of pity?" The question caught him off guard. "No, of course not." "Then why can't you accept that people might help you because they care about you, not because they pity you?" She moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "Quentin, you don't have to prove yourself to anyone, least of all me." But the stubborn pride that had sustained him through years of hardship wouldn't let him accept her words. In his mind, a man who couldn't support himself, let alone a wife, wasn't worthy of someone like Josephine. The tension between them grew as winter gave way to spring. Quentin became more withdrawn, working himself to exhaustion each day despite the pain that never fully subsided. Josephine continued to visit, but their conversations became strained, filled with things unsaid. The breaking point came in early April. Quentin had been helping with early calving, spending hours in the cold, damp weather that aggravated his still healing injuries. When Josephine arrived at the ranch, she found him collapsed in the barn, barely conscious, his breathing labored and his skin burning with fever. "Enough," she said firmly after she and Peterson had gotten him to his bed. "This has gone far enough." "I'm fine," Quentin insisted weakly. "Just need to rest a bit." "You're not fine," Josephine replied, her voice shaking with emotion. You're killing yourself trying to prove something that doesn't need proving." Through his fever haze, Quentin saw the tears in her eyes and felt a stab of guilt. "Josephine, no, you listen to me, Quentin Wade," she interrupted, her hands gentle but insistent as she tended to him. "I didn't fall in love with you because of your ability to work from sunrise to sunset without rest. I didn't agree to marry you because you could break the wildest horse or build a house with your bare hands." She paused, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "I love you for your heart, your integrity, your kindness. None of that has changed because you were injured." Quentin turned his face away, unable to bear the compassion in her eyes. "A man needs to provide for his wife, for his family. And you will," she assured him, "but not if you work yourself into an early grave first." The fever kept him bedridden for nearly a week. This time, Josephine enlisted Mrs. Hollister's help in caring for him, setting up a rotation that ensured he was never alone but also allowing her to continue her teaching duties. During those long days of enforced rest, Quentin had plenty of time to think. He watched Josephine as she graded papers by his bedside, discussing her students' progress with the same passion she'd shown months ago. He listened to her plans for expanding the school, her ideas for community education programs that would benefit adults as well as children. Slowly, painfully, he began to see what his pride had been blinding him to, that Josephine didn't need or want a man who would work himself to death to prove his worth. She wanted a partner who would support her dreams as much as she supported his. When he was finally well enough to sit outside, Quentin asked Peterson to join him for a conversation that was long overdue. "I can't keep doing what I've been doing," he admitted to his employer. "The doctor was right, my leg won't ever be what it was. Trying to pretend otherwise isn't working." Peterson nodded, unsurprised. "Been waiting for you to figure that out yourself. No sense me telling you you're too stubborn to listen." Despite everything, Quentin smiled at the accurate assessment. "I've been thinking about the land," he continued. "I still want to build there, but I need to find different work. Something that doesn't require the same physical demands." "Got any ideas?" Peterson asked. "A few," Quentin replied, thinking of the conversations he'd had with Josephine during his recovery. "This town's growing. Needs more than just ranching and farming to sustain it." Peterson studied him thoughtfully. "You know horses better than any man I've met. Not just breaking them, you understand them, how they think, what makes each one different." He paused. "There's good money in breeding and training quality stock. Not the backbreaking work of running a full ranch, but respectable work that a man with your knowledge could excel at, even with a bum leg." The suggestion resonated with something Quentin had been considering himself. "Would take capital to start," he mused, "and time to build a reputation." "I might be able to help with both," Peterson offered. "I've got connections with buyers back east always looking for good stock, and I'd be willing to invest in a breeding operation if it had the right man running it." For the first time in months, Quentin felt a genuine spark of hope. By the time Josephine arrived that afternoon, he had the outline of a plan that seemed both practical and promising. She listened without interrupting as he explained his conversation with Peterson and the new direction he was considering. When he finished, she took his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "This is what I've been waiting to hear," she said softly. "Not you giving up on your dreams, but adapting them to new circumstances, finding a path forward that works with your strengths rather than fighting against your limitations." "It won't be easy," he warned. "Building a reputation takes time. The house will have to wait a bit longer." Josephine smiled, a determined gleam in her eye. "Actually, I've been thinking about that too. Mrs. Hollister mentioned yesterday that she's considering moving to Denver to live with her sister. She might be willing to sell her house. It's small but solid and could be expanded over time." Quentin stared at her, amazed as always by her practical approach to obstacles. "You've been planning all this while I've been wallowing in self-pity, haven't you?" "Not planning exactly," she corrected gently. "Just looking for possibilities. That's what partners do, Quentin." They faced challenges together. The next few weeks brought rapid changes. Peterson made good on his offer, setting up meetings with potential investors interested in quality horseflesh. Mrs. Hollister, delighted by the prospect of Josephine and Quentin taking over her home, agreed to a very reasonable price that they could manage with their combined savings. Quentin still worked at the ranch, but now focused primarily on training and evaluating horses rather than the more physically demanding tasks. His leg continued to trouble him, especially in damp weather, but he learned to pace himself, to recognize when rest was necessary rather than viewing it as weakness. By early summer, they had secured financing for the breeding operation and purchased Mrs. Hollister's house. The wedding was set for July, a simple ceremony in the little church where they'd first begun to notice each other nearly a year before. The night before their wedding, Quentin took Josephine to the ridge where he'd first shown her his dreams of their future. The property he'd purchased still stood empty, but now with a new purpose in mind, the perfect location for their horse breeding operation, with its natural spring and sheltered meadows. "It's not exactly what we planned," he admitted as they watched the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. "But I think it might be better in the end." Josephine leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "The best plans are the ones that can change when life changes," she replied. "What matters is that we're facing it together." The following day, Josephine Caldwell became Josephine Wade in a ceremony attended by nearly everyone in Riversbend. Even Tom Briggs was there, his grudging respect for the schoolteacher having grown over the months as his son's academic abilities flourished under her guidance. Their first year of marriage brought challenges, the expected difficulties of starting a new business, the unexpected complication of Josephine's continued teaching while helping with the horse breeding operation, the occasional flare-ups of Quentin's old injuries that still frustrated him despite his acceptance of his limitations. But there were triumphs too. Their first foal born healthy and strong, the reputation of Wade-trained horses beginning to spread beyond the territory. Josephine's school expanding to include evening classes for adults, with Quentin himself occasionally teaching the finer points of horsemanship to eager students. By their second anniversary, they had moved operations to the Ridge property, building not the grand house Quentin had originally envisioned, but a comfortable, practical home that suited their needs perfectly. The breeding stock had grown to include some of the finest horses in the territory, with buyers coming from as far as St. Louis to examine their animals. It was on that anniversary that Josephine shared the news they'd been hoping for. They would be welcoming a child the following spring. The joy that flooded through Quentin at her words was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. That night, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the stars emerge above the valley they both loved, Josephine noticed Quentin's contemplative expression. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, squeezing his hand. "Just thinking about how different my life is from what I expected," he replied honestly. "5 years ago, I came to Riversbend with nothing but regrets behind me. Now I have everything I never dared hope for." "And all it took was being thrown from your horse and nearly buried in an avalanche," she teased gently. He laughed, pulling her closer. "No, all it took was you. You saw something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." Josephine's expression softened as she placed his hand over her still flat stomach where their child grew. "We saved each other, I think, and now we'll have one more person to love." As the evening deepened around them, Quentin Wade reflected on the long, hard road that had brought him to this moment. The physical pain would always be with him to some degree, a reminder of his mortality and the cost of his stubborn pride. But so too would the wisdom that came from nearly losing everything. He remembered Josephine's words on that desperate day when she'd found him collapsed in the barn. "You don't have to prove anything." At the time, he hadn't been able to accept them. Now he understood their truth. A man's worth wasn't measured by how long he could work before his body gave out, but by the love he gave and received, by the life he built with those who mattered most. Looking at his wife, his partner in every sense of the word, Quentin knew he'd finally found the peace he'd been seeking since long before he rode into Riversbend. The proof of his worth wasn't in the strength of his body, but in the strength of their bond, a love that had survived broken bones and broken dreams to emerge stronger, deeper, and more enduring than either of them could have imagined.